Hi everybody and welcome to episode 8 of Murder at Bedtime, the no waffle, no frills 10-minute true murder bedtime story. Tonight we have the unsolved murder of Dr. Helen Davidson. This is the finale of this first season, but never fear, I shall return with a special on Halloween and a new series on the 4th of November. Being as it's the final one of the series, I've decided to unleash my handsome face on you. This will be the new layout for YouTube, but the Facebook one will stay the same and always be first up. But excitingly, I will be releasing my first worldwide podcast soon, so look out for news of that. Anyway, let's get cracking. So here we go with the murder of Dr. Helen Davidson near Amersham in Buckinghamshire in 1966. While doing my research, I came across the very good book on the murder called Injured Parties: Solving the Murder of Dr. Davidson by Monica Weller. It took Monica 7 years to write this book and gives her opinion of the murderer. I have used it for a lot of reference, but along with my own searches and opinions, have condensed it into the usual bite-sized story that is Murder at Bedtime. But please, if you would like to know more on this fascinating stories, please, I recommend you either buy the book or just borrow it off me. So, with a big thank you to Monica, let's get started on this 54-year-old who done it, and see if you agree with Monica or myself as to who killed Dr. Helen Davidson on Wednesday the 9th of November 1966. 49-year-old Dr. Helen Davidson, not 54 as was reported at the time, was on her usual afternoon off, and as a lady of habit she and her dog Fancy set off in the doctor's pale blue Hillman Minx to do some bird watching, as she did every Wednesday afternoon. At Hodgemore Wood, a densely forested horseshoe-shaped piece of land of approximately 300 acres. She parked her car around 4 p.m. on Bottrell's Lane, opposite the Magpie pub, in full view of passing traffic. And after donning her binoculars, she locked their case and her bag in the car and strode into the woods with Fancy. Dr. Davidson's body was found at 2 p.m. the following afternoon, lying in dense woodland, about a mile from her car. The dog, unhurt, was still with her. Dr. Helen had been killed by a strike to the head with a length of charred wood. When she had fallen onto her back, the killer had ground her head into the ground with shod feet so hard that her eyes had been gouged into the back of her skull. There were no traces of a sexual attack. It was said locally that the hole in the earth where her head had been ground could be seen for several years after. Scotland Yard were brought in very quickly, and a whole lot of use they turned out to be. Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Razor Williams, I'm assuming the nickname was nothing to do with his sharpness, made the assumption right from the start that Dr. Helen had spied illicit lovers, most probably homosexuals, as homosexuality was still classed as a crime in the 60s and was punishable by imprisonment. And she had had to be silenced. Razor had made up his mind and he wasn't going to change it. But others, notably the local police, were not so sure. Helen couldn't be described as a much-loved doctor. Some weren't keen on her, some didn't like her, and at least 2 people plain hated her. One of these was a 27-year-old local man called Michael Larkham. Michael was a good-looking 21-year-old lad with a good job and a steady girlfriend when on Friday the 30th of June 1961, riding his motorcycle home on his lunch break from Brazil's meat processing plant to his home in Cheshire Boys. As he came down Station Road, Dr. Davidson turned her car right and stalled it in front of Michael. He had no chance and went straight into her. Michael suffered a fractured skull, 15 fractures to his face, requiring a facial rebuild, lost 7 teeth, a fractured femur, dislocated his hip and paralysis. He awoke from his coma a month later, ironically on Dr. Davidson's wedding day. He was never to be the same man again, and his bitterness didn't improve in years to come, when he believed her friends in high places got her off lightly in the subsequent court case. Michael did say if he saw the doctor outside her front door, he would kill her. Michael, however, had a watertight alibi. He was locked up in Oxford prison at the time of the murder. The second person who hated Helen was Helen's husband Herbert Baker's housekeeper, Kathleen Cook. She had served him loyally for 30 years while tending his first wife, that he had nursed until her death. When she died, she believed she was in with a chance with Herbert. She probably thought it was her right. There were rumours they had been having an affair for years. So she must have been livid when she found out Herbert was going to marry Helen, even though marrying and moving into Helen's house freed up his old cottage of Rosemead, which Herbert gave Kathleen to live in for the rest of her life. Would she still have kept the cottage if Herbert died and it went to Helen in his will? Incidentally, when Herbert did die, Kathleen did inherit Rosemead and half of Herbert's fortune. The police in public denied that she was a suspect, but this didn't stop them digging up her front and back garden. So what about husband Herbert Baker? This is also strange. Why did Helen marry a man 30 years her senior? She was comfortably well off and had a lovely house. Herbert too was well off. Nobody knew that they were romantically linked until they went off privately to get married. She didn't even take his name. They seem to have had nothing in common and didn't really socialise together. She didn't even tell her husband that she went to Hodgemore Woods on a Wednesday afternoon. So when he did actually get round to reporting her missing on the night she didn't come home, he didn't know where she could be. Also, 4 days after the murder, lay preacher Herbert gave a sermon at the local church asking for people to forgive the murderer. So now we get to the book's main suspect, bus driver George Garbutt. Garbutt had apparently suffered a brain injury during the war. He was a loner and, according to his GP, had a history of sexual failure. The GP said he was bisexual with a strong sexual urge. He got married at 39, but it is thought that this was for show purposes and his attraction was for men. According to his GP, who couldn't speak out about anything Garbutt said until his death, he had the habit of denying the murder of Dr. Davidson, even though it wasn't even being discussed. It was as if he needed to unburden himself. He had done something wrong to a woman, and the GP was sure he was near to confessing. Garbett's next appointment with his GP was scheduled for the 23rd of July 1971, and the GP was sure this would be the day. But George didn't turn up. Instead, he left his house, walked down to the old rectory where he worked part-time. He took his car out of one of the garages that he had left it in overnight, parked it outside the garage and got out. He went back in to fetch a can of fuel, doused himself in it, climbed into the front seat of the car and struck a match. He left no note. The files of the conversations between George and his GP are closed for 100 years. I've got to say I'm not convinced. Even though I thoroughly enjoyed the book, in my expert opinion, my money is on Kathleen, the housekeeper. For years after, many locals referred to her as the murderess, and I think she had most to gain. But then, maybe that's why I'm a factory worker and not a detective chief inspector. If you read the book, I'm sure you will make your own conclusions, maybe having a different suspect that I haven't mentioned here. If so, please let me know, because as you must have realised by now, I love an add-on. As always, thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you all for the special at Halloween. And if you carry on watching, there is a short quiz about this case coming up right now. So if you are still here, number 1, what year was the murder? 2, who wrote the book Injured Parties? 3, how old was Dr. Davidson when she died? 4, what was her dog called? 5, which pub did Dr. Davidson park opposite? 6, how long was Michael in a coma? 7, what job did George Garbett do? 8, what was the name of Kathleen Cook's cottage? 9, what make of car did Dr. Davidson drive? And 10, whose nickname was Razor? I will print the answers tomorrow. Sleep well and don't have nightmares. Good night.